Good afternoon. I'm Dan with Four Winds Ancestral Skills. Today we're going to be talking about rocks. What you need to know as a beginner to work with stone tools. So stick around. Alright, since the dawn of time, one of man's oldest tools is stone. There's a lot of things you can do with stone. Obviously, through the millennia of mankind working with stone, a lot of people have gotten very good at it, from flint knapping to pecking and grinding to doing all sorts of things to making tools. There's an incredible amount of utility in stone. There's some certain things that you need to think about when you're using it, most notably that, say you have something like this, if you try to pry with it, it will snap like nothing. So, if you're used to using metal tools, you have to make a few modifications to what you're doing, but ultimately, in the backcountry, stone is an incredibly useful tool. It's very underrated. There's a lot of things you can do with it. Everything from making knives, arrowheads, tomahawks, celts, all sorts of tools and things. And a lot of those are fairly easy to make. You can make a crude stone tool with pretty much nothing. Two rocks together, hit them together, get a sharp edge, and you can do a lot with just that. The first thing we need to talk about is different types of stone, because ultimately they all have different properties and that affects how you use them. For the first one, there's a piece of obsidian. Here's another piece of chert. These types of stones here, they have a high silica content. So that high silica content, they fracture a lot like glass. So rather than just breaking randomly, when you strike them certain ways, it will actually make a conchoidal fracture and pieces that basically you can get predictable chunks off of this rock. For instance, here's a piece of mahogany obsidian. You can see it's extremely flat. That is from chipping off a larger piece, and what it'll do is these small chips can come off, and then with this you can make different kinds of tools and whatnot that are flat, and you can fashion them into what you want a lot easier. Now, there's a few different types of rocks that have silica in them, such as the obsidian and chert that I showed. Those are excellent examples. There's other rocks, it varies what kind of silica content you're going to get in them, what kind of quality, even different types of chert and whatnot. Oftentimes, if they're found on the surface of the ground, they'll have freeze fractures in them. So, you'll take a piece of rock like this, and there'll be micro cracks in the actual rock. So if you go to try to nap some pieces off it, you'll not have a whole lot of success, unfortunately. So that is one thing to keep in mind, that if it's on the surface, there's a good chance it could have freeze fractures. You still might be able to get small pieces off of that and utilize, like even a piece like this, or much smaller. When it does shear off, it has an extremely sharp edge here. So that sharp edge, you can use that for any sort of cutting, for processing game, anything you would use a knife for ultimately. Things like obsidian, glass, even old beer bottles. You can nap them, and the edge, when it naps off, is actually sharper than a scalpel. It goes down to a molecular level. So these pieces of rock, especially glass and obsidian, are extremely sharp. Now the edges usually aren't as durable as metal, so you have to be careful. They'll dull up or they'll break off because they're very brittle. But if you know how to use them right, and you're careful with them, you can get a lot of use out of some basic flakes like that. Now, another type of rock is something more like this. This is more common, what you'll see in certain areas. It's just a rough rock. It's hard. It's this piece here happens to be granite. It's very common. It's not terribly good at flaking, anything like that. It does have a fairly sharp edge here on this one side. You can see that. So you could use this as it is to chop or to do some bit of cutting, not terribly well. If you took, say, a rock like this and this, and just hit it, you're going to get just an ugly fracture right here. You're not going to be able to do a predictable tool doing it that way with what's called flint knapping. The other things like obsidian, chert, stuff like that, flint knapping is an extremely expedient and fairly predictable way of making a tool. Unfortunately, this type of rock doesn't really work that way. You have to do what's called pecking and grinding. Now, it depends what kind of rock you get, how hard it is, stuff like that. But what you would do is take another rock and you essentially just try to shape it how you want, peck it, and then grind it. And it takes a heck of a lot more time, but you still can make tools like celts and different things like that. You can even make, if you have the patience, you can make bowls like mano and metate, the stone bowl. So you still can make stone tools even if you have something like, granite, some kind of hard rock like that. So you're not out of the game just because you don't happen to have obsidian and chert. Now, I really like obsidian because, well, it looks really cool, but it's not, the only places in the U.S. are out west. I grew up in Oregon. There was some out in the eastern side of Oregon. Not terribly common, but you can order, seriously, boxes of this stuff from either out west, down in Mexico. There's a ton down there. The Aztecs, fun history fact, the Aztecs used to worship obsidian. You might have heard that they would make daggers out of it and cut the hearts out of the people they would sacrifice, but they also did worship obsidian because they bestowed some magical properties onto it. So it's an interesting stone to work with. But those are really the two main types of stone. There's high silica content stone like the chert and obsidian, things like that. And then there's kind of a gray line, jasper, coralized agate, certain things like that will flint knap to an extent, but they're certainly not as easy as say chert and obsidian and stuff like that. And then after you get out of that, it's kind of everything else, any kind of conglomerate rock or granite like we have out here, stuff like that. Slate, one thing with slate is it will often shear off in sheets naturally, so you can take those and basically grind them down into a good point. So that's one way to do work with slate that it actually works pretty well. So using stone tools, that's the first consideration, is what type of stone that you have. Now we talked a little bit about the different types of stones. We'll talk briefly about where to find good stone. Really depends on your area. Everywhere is different. Right now I'm living in the Missouri Ozarks. Certain areas of the Ozarks do have chert in them. Like I said, you have to be careful. A lot of times stuff on the surface has freeze fractures, so it's not the best quality. Stream beds, river beds, things like that sometimes can pay off. Sometimes it's hard to know. On the outside of the rock, it might look like a basic rock. On the inside, it might have a vein of chert in it that you never know by looking at the outside. So what you do is, if you find some rock that maybe it has a fracture, a smooth surface, that's a telltale sign that it could have a high silica content and be good for flint knapping. Look for fractures, like similar to glass. As you can see, it has lots of fracture lines, things like that. You can try to look for telltale signs like that, and then really, if you suspect that it might be good for knapping, you can basically just take a piece and break it. So let's say for this one here, I would just hit it. You can see it flakes off. If it flakes off, then that's what you're dealing with, is something that could be knapped. Now, like I said, there's different varying qualities. Even the varying skill of how good you are at knapping will take into account as far as if it's a tough rock to knap, you're still kind of a beginner. You might not have good success, but ultimately, just breaking that rock, you will get more experience the more you do it. So even if you just want to play around with this, it's a good learning tool. And doing flint knapping isn't something you're going to pick up like overnight. I feel like it's not terribly difficult to kind of get the basics, get the hang of it. But to become really good at it, I feel like takes some time. It's not something you're going to master overnight. Once you understand kind of the basic rules, though, I feel like you can do a pretty good job. Like I said, even making crude tools, things like that, you can do an effective job at that. Another thing is to check out the geology. Get kind of boring, hit the books. What's the geology of your area? Like I said, here, where I particularly am, is a lot of granite. Certain other parts of Missouri, there's a decent amount of chert. So you have to kind of look at the geology of the area that you're in to determine what is natural there. If all else fails, you can order rocks online. Like for me, the Obsidian, there's no way I'm getting natural Obsidian anywhere close to here. So I have to order Obsidian online and then, deal with that. Another option to practice flint knapping is actually using glass, because glass has basically the same properties of Obsidian. What I normally do is I break the bottoms off the bottles. I don't have one here to display, but you can take a beer bottle, anything like that, put a nail in it, and then just shake it. And then the nail will go around the bottom, and the bottom will literally fall out of the beer bottle. So any kind of glass bottle like that, you can take that bottom and flint knap that, and it flint knaps very well. And it's free because, especially the way a lot of people are, they'll just throw their glass trash out in the woods, and I try to pick some of that stuff up, and while I'm picking it up, I might as well get a little bit of use out of some of the things like the old glass bottles and things like that. So you might be asking yourself, well, stone tools are cool and all, and they have their place in history, but what do they mean to us now? We have metal tools and saws and all that sort of thing, so why should we even bother with this type of thing? Well, it's true that metal has kind of supplanted stone as the main tool that we use, but that doesn't mean that you still can't utilize stone tools for what they are. A simple piece of rock like this, even with just picking it up and striking it against a stick, you can do chopping, some bit of cutting, stuff like that. So they may not be as good in metal as a lot of ways, but oftentimes they are available where you're not going to find metal. Another way, this would be just a simple picking up a rock. You could up it a little bit, say something like this, tomahawk. If you want to do some chopping, this will work pretty well. Again, it's not a hatchet. It's not going to be as fast as a hatchet, but it will chop. Now, when you are chopping with stone tools, keep in mind a couple things. Number one, what you're working on. If I took this and glanced down and accidentally hit this stone right here, I would easily chip this blade right here. I have a piece of leather underneath it, and I'm being really careful to only hit the actual wood. So that's important. Next is, like I said, these blades are very brittle side to side, so you don't want to bend them at all. You just want to go straight into what you're working with. And then the third thing, when you are using as a chopping tool, cutting a piece of wood like this, you want to basically cut a V. So I'm kind of holding it. What I'll do is cut a little bit to this side, angle it over a little bit, and then cut this side. And then just kind of go back and forth. You can do this with a standing tree as well. Just essentially go all the way around it, cutting a V-notch in there until you're able to just break it off. Like I said, useful, but not the same as having a hatchet or something like that. Now, another thing here, piece of obsidian. It's got some pretty decently sharp edges, but let's say we need to cut something. Could take a piece of obsidian right here. It's always good to use a leather pad with this, and I'll go over a lot more of this in the future videos, but just to get a quick sharp edge here. Alright, now we have a small blade. It pretty much is a second to make. It's super sharp, and what we can do with it is, let's say there's some shaping we need to do, or processing of game, anything like that. We can take this and either use it just as it is, or we can fashion it to a stick of some kind and kind of make a little hand blade. But oftentimes all you need to do is something like this if you want to do some cutting and shaping, and it will perform just like a knife. We have our piece of obsidian here that we took off. Now we can use this to do any sort of cutting, shaping, anything like that. I have a piece of wood here as an example. Now what you want to do is, when you get a piece of obsidian like this, if you do want to use it to work by hand, you can just take it and kind of grind the really sharp edge away, the back edge that you're going to be using, and kind of grind it on another rock. What that'll do is that will keep this edge, the back edge that you're going to be using, able to be grasped and not cut the hell out of yourself, because like I said, these blades are extremely sharp down to the molecular level. So they will cut you extremely fast if you're not careful. But what you can do is, like I said, just kind of grind that away, and you got a much safer edge on this side. Now, using this, you can just take it and use it just like you would a regular blade. You want to whittle this away. Depending on what you're making, it just depends. But you can't use it that way. Another way, this side over here that has been flattened, you can use that as a scraper. It will work pretty well. The sharp edge, you have to be careful using it as a scraper, because the edge might just break off if you're not careful. But if you need something like, if you're doing some kind of working with hides, you need a scraper. The back edges of these, when they're dulled out a little bit, work pretty well, honestly. Now, getting past that, getting into an actual stone blade. Depending on how you do it, you can make them a little more serrated, so they work a little bit better as a saw, or you can work them a little sharper. It just kind of depends on the use of them. But they do work fairly well. Just even this one, I didn't really make it that way. It's kind of dull right now, but you can take it and into the wood like that. And it will work pretty well, depending on what you're doing with it. Like I said, there's 1,000,001 tasks that you can do out in the woods, but that would be one example, is using it basically as a saw. Also, you can, this one isn't quite as sharp right now, but you can use it, depending on its shape, both as a scraper or as a actual cutting tool. And it will work moderately well. Like I said, we're not dealing with modern metal tools that work super well, but they do work, and if all else fails, you always have some kind of tool, or some kind of tool at your disposal when you're out in the woods. One thing I do want to talk about briefly is different types of stone blades. Here's an example here. It's a good looking blade, and it is fairly sharp, but one thing, if it's a two-piece design like this one, is this is a jawbone here. This joint right here is a weak point. So if you are using it for some kind of bushcraft activities and whatnot, this can be a point of failure if you're not careful with it. I like the two-piece design. However, you have to be aware that it is a point of failure. Something like this is a solid piece with just a leather-wrapped handle here, so there's no point of failure there. You can still snap it, stuff like that, but it's not going to have a point of failure unnecessarily, I guess you could say. It doesn't take away from the beauty and the quality of something like this, but just be aware of that if you're using it for bushcraft and you're hard on it in the bush, that can be a point of failure. I hope this gave you some ideas of maybe a little intro to what it is to work with stone, especially flint knapping in this first video here. Like I said, you can make everything from blades to arrowheads to actually my bracelet is a flint knapped piece of obsidian into a crescent shape. There's a lot of things you can do with this skill that is, I feel, in a lot of ways underrated. Most of the time when I'm out here teaching people how to do survival and stuff like that in the woods, I normally use stone blades. Sometimes I throw in some metal and stuff like that, but I feel like if you can do it with a stone blade well, you can do it with a metal blade in your sleep almost. Because modern tools do make things ultimately easier. If I'm going to chop down a tree, hands down, it's going to be easier if I have an axe and a saw. So, if you're good with stone tools, then you can ace any kind of metal tools for the most part. Not to mention, it does kind of connect you to your ancestors. Part of being in the woods, at least for me, is to kind of connect with the natural world, to connect with my ancestors, to kind of walk in their footsteps to an extent. Our modern day and age is so much removed from that. And any little piece we can take back, whether it's just a walk in the woods or coming out here making stone tools to using a bow and arrow, it doesn't matter. Anything that helps us connect to our roots, to where we have been as people for tens of thousands of years. This is our home out here in the wilderness. And anything that helps me connect to that, I feel good about. I hope you learned a lot from this video, and if you have any questions, comments, concerns, make sure to get a hold of me. You can email me or connect to me on my website. And as always, until next time, I'll see you out there.